For centuries, the story of Merlin has come to us in fragments, a shadowy figure on the edges of Arthurian legend, part prophet, part magician, part madman. His origins have always been uncertain, tangled in folklore, Latin chronicles, and medieval romances. His story has always remained a mystery, until now. Earlier this year, at Cambridge University Library, a plain 16th century register of property deeds sat quietly on a shelf, a thoroughly ordinary book, concealing an extraordinary secret in plain sight. What followed is a story of forensic technology, medieval secrets, and a version of Merlin unlike any you've heard before. Because this lost Merlin text changes everything. Welcome back, Darklings. What if everything you thought you knew about Merlin was wrong? Earlier this year, researchers at Cambridge University Library were examining a 16th century register of property deeds from Suffolk, an Elizabethan document used to record the holdings of Huntingfield Manor. It had been handled before, catalogued, even displayed, but no one had ever paid much attention to its cover. Its binding was crude, stitched together from what appeared to be scraps of parchment, but something about it stood out. The language wasn't English, it wasn't Latin, it was Old French, a dialect spoken by medieval aristocrats, long abandoned in England by the time this book was created. And then came the name, faint, repeating, whispered across the fading lines of text, Merlin. The team quickly realised the cover had once been part of a much older manuscript, cut, folded, and stitched in place to protect a completely unrelated legal record. What they'd found was a surviving fragment of the Suite Vulgate du Merlin, a rare 13th century continuation of the Merlin legend. There are fewer than 40 known manuscripts of this suite, and no two are alike. Each was painstakingly copied by hand centuries ago. And this newly uncovered page, written between 1275 and 1315, now joins them, placing it squarely in the golden age of medieval romance. But there was a problem. The fragment was delicate, torn, folded into creases so deep that unfolding it physically could destroy it forever. In the past, scholars would have had no choice but to cut it free, destroying precious evidence in the process. But this time, the team took a different path. They preserved the fragment in situ, intact inside the book, and turned to technology never before used on an object like this. Using multispectral imaging, macro-probe lenses, and even CT scanning, they virtually unfolded the parchment without ever disturbing its fibres. It was a forensic triumph, and a turning point in manuscript conservation. And in March of this year, after 7 centuries of silence, the manuscript was finally read again. What it revealed was something very strange indeed. What emerged from the parchment was bizarre, dreamlike, and entirely unlike the noble wizard of modern Arthurian retellings. This was a Merlin steeped in medieval symbolism, strange transformations, and the shadows of demonic influence. In this version, Merlin appears as a blind harpist, drifting at the edges of Arthur's early reign. A figure of mystery and power, he eventually vanishes, only to reappear as a balding child who issues royal commands while wearing no underwear. Yes, really. The fragment portrays Merlin as a shapeshifter, a being who moves fluidly through forms, times, and roles. His shifting nature reflects his otherworldly origins and serves as a reminder that he is not entirely bound by human laws. This child Merlin, strange and otherworldly, requests to carry Arthur's standard into battle. The king agrees, and it's a good decision, because Merlin shows up on the battlefield with a fire-breathing dragon, summoned through magical means, turning the tide of war in Arthur's favour. The text also hints at his diabolical parentage, born of a mortal woman and the devil himself. This Merlin is not the benevolent advisor of later legend. He is chaotic, unpredictable, divine and damned in equal measure. And all of this is unfolding during the formative years of Arthur's reign, before the establishment of the Round Table, before the Grail quests, before Lancelot and Guinevere. A time when Arthur was still a young hero, and Merlin's role was far more active and far stranger. But where did this version of Merlin come from, and why is it so different from the one we know? To understand this strange shape-shifting Merlin, we have to go back, far before King Arthur ever drew his sword from the stone. Long before he was a court magician or royal advisor, Merlin was a madman in the woods. The earliest version of the figure we now call Merlin appears in early Celtic mythology in the form of Merlin Weitht, a wild prophet said to have gone mad after witnessing the horrors of war. He fled into the forest, lived among the animals, and began speaking in riddles and visions, a solitary, haunted figure, closer to a druid or shaman than a wizard. But here's where things get interesting. Some historians believe Merlin Weitht may have been based on a real person, a bard or warrior from 6th century Scotland, who fought in the Battle of Arv Dyrith, a real historical conflict between rival kings. After the slaughter, this man is said to have gone mad with grief and retreated to the woods, where he lived in exile and was believed to possess second sight. His tale was passed down orally, embellished, rewritten, and eventually absorbed into Welsh poetry. But the seed of it, that might have been real, and he wasn't alone. Merlin Weitht's story closely echoes that of Lalo Ken, another wild man of the forest in medieval folklore, also said to have been driven mad by war, also speaking in riddles. In some tales, the two are even confused or merged, both becoming strange, prophetic figures lingering at the edges of society. These wild men were feared, pitied, and revered in equal measure. They weren't seen as simply insane. They were touched by something deeper. Madness and prophecy often went hand in hand in medieval thought. But centuries later, that wildness would be reshaped. In the 12th century, a Welsh cleric named Geoffrey of Monmouth compiled a work known as the Prophetiae Merlini, the Prophecies of Merlin. It claimed to reveal the visions of a powerful seer, but Geoffrey wasn't simply recording existing tales, he was transforming them. He took the madman of the forest and turned him into a political prophet, a figure who could predict the fate of kings, the rise of empires, and the destiny of Britain itself. In Geoffrey's Prophetiae Merlini, Merlin foresees invasions, royal betrayals, and future monarchs. He even predicts the coming of a great leader, the Boar of Cornwall, widely interpreted as King Arthur himself. Through these visions, Geoffrey transformed Merlin into a vessel for national myth, a mythic figure used to prove a king's right to rule, suggesting that Britain's fate was foretold, and that its rulers reigned by divine, magical design. Later medieval readers believed these prophecies were real. Some even cited them in political disputes and royal claims, treating Geoffrey's work not as fiction, but as a sacred key to the future of the nation. And crucially, Geoffrey never said this was a work of fiction. He wrote in the style of a historian, blending real historical figures with prophecy and myth. He claimed to be translating the Prophetiae Merlini from an ancient book, but no one else ever saw this source. It gave his work an air of authenticity that few questioned. Geoffrey's works became wildly influential. Later chroniclers began treating them as history. Merlin was no longer just a character in a poem, he was a figure of supposed fact, woven into the imagined past of the British Isles. But his origins were still troubling. Because Geoffrey included one detail that earlier stories had not, Merlin's father was a demon, a literal incubus. His mother, a chaste mortal woman. Their union produced a child with knowledge no human should possess. This wasn't just for shock value, it was a clever solution. In medieval literature, especially after Christianity took hold, supernatural abilities were a theological problem. If someone could see the future, perform magic, or command spirits, that power had to come from somewhere. And there were only two accepted sources: God, in which case they were a prophet or saint, or the devil, in which case they were dangerous, or evil. Now Merlin, especially in Geoffrey of Monmouth's version, has knowledge no one else should have. He makes accurate prophecies, speaks of things to come, and understands cosmic forces, but he doesn't behave like a saint or a biblical prophet. He's too unruly, too strange. So Geoffrey needed a backstory, something to explain Merlin's powers without making him either blessed or wicked. He solved this by saying Merlin inherited his gifts from a demon father, but was baptized at birth, cutting the devil's full influence short. It gave medieval writers the perfect loophole. The demonic heritage explained his unnatural abilities, the baptism explained why he wasn't evil. It allowed Merlin to be both mysterious and morally ambiguous. A supernatural being whose powers could serve a divine plan, without being divine himself. But as the centuries passed, Merlin changed again. In the hands of later French and English writers, especially during the Romance boom of the 13th and 14th centuries, he began to soften. The wild man of the forest became the wise man of the court. The ragged cloak was exchanged for scholars' robes. These were stories written for noble audiences, especially women, who were fascinated by courtly love, spiritual quests, and moral virtue. And in these tales, Merlin evolved to match those values. He became a mentor, a teacher, a trusted advisor to kings. No longer mad, no longer monstrous, still magical, but now refined, a safe spiritual figure for civilized times. Even his darker origins were sometimes downplayed or forgotten. The wildness, the madness, the demonic edge, those were trimmed away over time, replaced by wisdom, patience, and quiet authority. This is the Merlin most people know today. But in taming him, something essential was lost. The older Merlin, the chaotic, otherworldly, shape-shifting figure, was buried beneath centuries of storytelling, and yet the newly discovered manuscript brings him back. What makes this discovery especially significant is its timing. The fragment has been dated to between 1275 and 1315, a period when Merlin had already been reshaped into the wise, courtly advisor we recognise today. By then, the older version of Merlin, the wild prophet, the shapeshifter, the child of demonic forces, had been largely pushed aside. His pagan and chaotic roots didn't fit the Christian ideals of the time. By all accounts, this Merlin should be tamed. He should be robed, reasonable, and safe, and yet here he is. In a manuscript from the very heart of that transformation, we find a version that refuses to behave. It suggests that not everyone had moved on, that even as medieval writers tried to civilize him, some were still clinging to the older Merlin, the one who belonged not to the church, but to the forest. And that survival is only possible because of the groundbreaking techniques developed at Cambridge. These methods could transform how we preserve the past, making it possible to read thousands of fragile texts that were once thought lost to time. And this rediscovered Merlin manuscript is the first glimpse of what those hidden pages might hold. Take the image of the blind harpist. In medieval literature, blindness was often symbolic, not of weakness, but of spiritual vision. The ability to see inward or beyond. This Merlin isn't helpless, he's attuned to forces no one else can perceive. And the harp? That links him directly to the bardic traditions of Celtic culture. Bards weren't just entertainers. They were respected figures, poets, historians, and seers, tasked with preserving the oral histories of their people. They carried ancestral knowledge, told the tales of heroes, and often claimed prophetic insight through dreams or ecstatic song. In some traditions, they were even believed to be touched by the other world. They were living oracles, and Merlin in this form fits their image perfectly. Then there's the bald, trouserless child issuing royal commands. It sounds ridiculous, but in medieval thought, childhood and nakedness were both powerful symbols. A child could represent rebirth, divine foolishness, or even holy innocence. And nudity? It often signified truth, unmasked and unashamed, or in some cases a kind of prophetic purity. And then there's the dragon. Merlin's association with dragons stretches all the way back to Geoffrey of Monmouth's writings, where he famously reveals the future of Britain by interpreting the battle between a red and a white dragon beneath a collapsing tower. The red dragon, Merlin explains, represents the native Britons, the white, the invading Saxons, and though the red dragon struggles, it ultimately triumphs. This prophecy later became tied to Welsh national identity, and it's why the red dragon still flies on the Welsh flag today. In this newly discovered manuscript, Merlin's summoning of a fire-breathing dragon is more than spectacle, its power made visible. And finally, the devil. This manuscript doesn't suggest Merlin is evil, but it leans into the old tradition that he was born of a mortal woman and a demon, a child of both heaven and hell. In medieval theology, that made him something unique, neither wholly damned nor entirely redeemed. But if you thought Merlin's true story was strange, wait until you dive beneath the surface of The Little Mermaid. Click here to discover the dark, real-life tale that inspired the fairy tale you thought you knew. See you in a future video.